Hi, I'm Jessica Mao from the University of Texas at Austin. This video is part 2 of a two-part series on decision-making in the DBI Framework. Make sure to check out part 1 before watching this video about database individualization. In the previous video, I talked about the DBI or Database Individualization Framework and its essential elements like using validated intervention program or strategies, collecting progress monitoring data, using diagnostic data if necessary, and making instructional adaptations as you see fit. In this video, I'm going to talk about analyzing students' performance and progress. Before we make any decisions from students' progress monitoring data, it's important that we understand these three features of graph data: level, trend, and variability. They provide us with important information about students' growth relative to the individualized instruction that has been provided to them. On students' graph data, when we talk about level, we're looking at where the data points fall on the graph compared to the goal line. As for trend, we're looking at how the data's rate of growth compares to the goal line. And in terms of variability, we're looking at the bounds in data. So let's take a look at level, where we are looking at student data points compared to the goal line. We can ask ourselves, are most points above the goal line? Are the most points below the goal line? Or are most points near the goal line? So looking at this graph, what do you notice about the data points relative to the goal line? You might see that the data points, or most of them, are pretty even with the goal line. How about this one? What do you notice about the data points here relative to the goal line? You'll see that most or all of the points fall below that goal line. And finally here, what do you notice about the data points here relative to the goal line? You'll see that most of the points fall above the goal line. Next, when we look at trend, we're looking at the data's rate of growth compared to the goal line. You might ask yourself, is the trend line above or steeper than the goal line? Is the trend line even or about the same as the goal line? Or is the trend line flatter or below that goal line? So when we're talking about the trend of the data, we're comparing the trend line for the data points to the goal line. The goal line is based off the goal you've established for that student. So here in this graph, what do you notice about the trend of the data? You should see that the trend line is pretty even with the goal line. And when you see that, the decision is to keep as is because what you're doing is working. Let's look at this example. What do you notice about the trend of this data? You should see that the trend line is below that goal line. If the trend line is below the goal line, it might be time to make an instructional change. When you want to make an instructional change, you want to mark your graph to indicate the time when you began that change. For example, if I make an instructional change after September 15th, I should mark it like this right here, which will help me later on as I look back at the data to determine if that change actually made a positive impact on student performance as progress monitoring continues. Here's another example. What do you notice about the trend of this data? You should see that the trend line is above the goal line, and if the trend line is above the goal line, it might be time to make the goal more rigorous or consider maybe making your instruction more challenging for that student. Finally, we want to look at the variability of students' data. You might ask yourself, is there a lot of variability between scores, or are the scores relatively stable? You want to consider why a student has variability in their data. Now, looking at this graph, what do you notice about the variability of the data? Here, you probably see that there's an extreme score that might be impacting the overall trend of the data. Was this extreme score due to a student being absent from that week, or was it because the student was sick or having kind of an off day? These are just a few reasons why we might see variability like this. When there is variability, it can be hard to be certain about whether or not to make an instructional change. In most cases, you might not want to make an instructional change just yet, maybe take a few more weeks to collect more data to be a little bit more sure. And in these cases, use your best judgment to determine the possible costs and the best way to proceed. Now that we understand the key components of decision-making using graph data, we can now think more about the decision-making process. When using individual student data to make decisions about math instruction, this flowchart can be helpful to refer to as it takes you through each step with instruction on what to consider. This flowchart can be helpful and serve as a guide for you throughout the DBI process, and let's take a closer look. The first step in applying the decision-making flowchart is ensure that we have enough data points to make a reasonable decision. Too few data points and we might not have enough information to know if the intervention is effective. Too many data points now, then we risk waiting too long to make changes to best support our student. We recommend having about 4 to 6 progress monitoring data points in order to make a decision. Here we can see that this student, Johnny, has baseline data in the orange and that using the median baseline score, a goal has been set for each measure for QD, MP, and PR, which is shown by the green goal line. The student has 5 data points at this time, shown in gray, making this an appropriate time to make a decision. Following our decision flowchart for Johnny, we've ensured that we have 4 to 6 data points. We looked at the trend lines for all 3 measures and determined that based on the universal screening data, we'll look at all 3 graphs to make a decision. Moving forward, we'll consider the trend lines more specifically. As you can see, there are 3 options. If the majority of the trend lines are steeper than the goal line, indicating that the student is on track to perform better than the goal set, we would consider increasing that goal. Now, if the trend lines are mostly even with the goal lines, this will mean that the student is on track to meet their goals and we will not have to make any changes, but continue as is. Note here that we'll want to monitor these graphs weekly to catch any major changes that might require reconsideration. If the trend lines are flatter than the goal lines, this will indicate that the student is not on track to meet the goals. Let's take a look at these more closely. If the trend lines are flatter than the goal lines, we first want to consider if the intervention was given with fidelity. Was the intervention given as intended, as often as intended? Was the student present for the intervention? If the intervention was not delivered as intended, we can't be sure that the data really shows that it was ineffective. So think about a healthy habit you want to implement or establish as an example. Say I want to develop the habit of reading more consistently and I give myself the goal of reading the 200-page book in say 20 days for 10 pages each day. My plan is reading 10 pages each day, and by the end of the 20 days, if I did not finish a book, I can't really say that the plan was ineffective if I did not read 10 pages each day, which means that I probably didn't implement the plan with fidelity or as intended. So same is true with DBI. If the intervention wasn't given as intended or with fidelity, then my next step would be to improve my implementation fidelity before looking at the data again. In the case that the intervention was given with fidelity, then we can say that it isn't effective for that particular student and we can make a change to the instruction. Your coach will support you in thinking about whether the change would be increasing the intensity of the intervention or targeting a different skill or content that might be more appropriate for that student. In any case, the stair-tailored videos are a great resource moving forward with improving student outcomes. So let's look back at Johnny's data. Considering all 3 graphs, it looks like the trend lines of the QD and PR measures are steeper than the goal lines. MP is flatter. However, all the data points are well above the goal, and so in this case, we can go with the majority, which would indicate that we would raise the goal. Each student's data will be different, and as such, this flowchart is a helpful guide to follow, but your coach will help you think about individual students. So for Johnny, the teacher and the coach decided to raise the goal on the QD and the PR measure, but to leave the MP for now. And then they'll reconsider in a few more data points to see if the trend lines change. If it appears that the instructional change the teacher is implementing is effective and that's reflected by the student's progress monitoring data, it's great and that the teacher should continue implementing that intervention and continue to collect progress monitoring data. In a few weeks, the teacher and the coach can meet again to go over the data, the new data, to talk through the flowchart and the decision making. Thank you for watching this Stair-Tailored. Check out our other videos in the channel for more content on mathematics instruction.